Hello, welcome to Chapter 9, How Good is the Evidence?, which is a continuation of Chapter 8 for Humanities 140, Critical Thinking in the Modern Age. So let's start off talking about personal observations. For years, we have relied on them for eyewitness testimony and for recollections, and the court system used to see the eyewitness testimony as probably the most compelling part of a court case. However, over and over again, we have seen eyewitness testimony being wrong. So why does this happen? Well, first, what people see is filtered through their own values, biases, attitudes, and expectations. Remember, we oftentimes have no idea that we are evaluating ideas on our own perception of how behavior should be. And as a consequence, we may see someone's behavior filtered through our own set of biases. Additionally, people also tend to see and hear what they want to see and hear. And this is, again, one of those situations that if you think about it, and you think about the last time you had a fight with your love muffin, of course, it kind of devolves into this shouting or angriness, and it's their favorite thing to be mad about and your favorite thing to be mad about. Additionally, our memories are malleable, shifting and adapting as we remember them, and I'll explain this more in detail in a few minutes. So there's an organization called the Innocence Project, and their job is to essentially overturn convictions through DNA testing. And what they have identified as being one of the biggest issues is eyewitness misidentification. And it's the most significant contributing factor to wrongful convictions, playing a role in more than 70% of convictions overturned through DNA testing nationwide. So why are we so likely to have a misidentification when we witness a crime? Again, we have our own personal biases, but also in a stressful situation, such as the lighting isn't great, the viewing time of the situation was incredibly brief, 1 or 2 seconds, or a visually distracting element such as a gun or a knife can influence our perceptions. Also, gaps in sensory input are filled in by expectations that are based on an individual's prior experience with the world, which again can cause biased perceptions. So a person who is in the midst of being raped or attacked, they may only have a few seconds to glance at the person before they get knocked unconscious or they have some other method to cover the eyes. And, all of us have these perception issues. So studies collected by the National Academy of Science have shown that eyewitnesses are more likely to make mistakes when making an identification among people of another race rather than when making an identification of a person from the eyewitness's own race. An innocent black suspect has a 56%, that's a huge number, greater chance of being misidentified in a police lineup by a white eyewitness than a black eyewitness. Additionally, memory is not a very good record of what we perceived through sight. The way our brains work is that when we're in a stressful situation, we get a shot of adrenaline and norepinephrine, which causes our fight or flight response to kick in. Both of these chemicals change how we perceive what we're experiencing. Now, we go a couple weeks in the future, you remember back to that incredibly stressful experience. Those memories become processed, encoded, stored, and retrieved. And here's the thing, every time we retrieve them, they change just a minute amount. So our constant reminding or remembering induces this consistent swap of fact and filling in the gaps. So there's so many issues, and it's not because people are necessarily prejudiced, it's because our brains fill in empty spaces for us. So now we're going to move on to research studies. And these are among the best options to verify and validate evidence. But these studies are not perfect, so of course there will be some pitfalls. Before we get into the meat and potatoes, I want to make sure we all know what the scientific method is. So if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, you're going to see a first in the purple, ask a question, and then we do the background research. We construct a hypothesis. We test our hypotheses by doing experiments. We analyze our data and draw conclusions, and then we report our results, determining whether or not our hypothesis was correct. This format is used by all researchers at universities and privately funded researchers. The purpose of this is that you have a standard format that everybody follows, which makes it easy to essentially take it apart and see if it's a worthy research study. Information that is publicly verifiable, which means that the data is collected under circumstances so that other researchers could replicate the study and get the same result. Remember, replication or reproducing the study will only continue to validate it if the results are the same. If a researcher tries to reproduce a study and they get significantly different results, that calls into question the original study. Special procedures must be in place to reduce error in observation and interpretation of data, also known as controls. The other element here is the use of precise and consistent language. Oftentimes when we look at a study, we ask ourselves, why does it have to be written with such multisyllabic words? Why couldn't they simplify it? And the reality is that a lot of basic words are not precise enough. And as a consequence, they open up issues of interpretation, whereas a more precise multisyllabic word is not going to open it up for interpretation at all. So, one of the main problems with a research study is the quality of the studies vary. If you look to see how often a study is cited, this will give you perspective on the quality of the study. So this is an example from Google Scholar, which is an awesome site if you have not used it. It is a study called The Depressive Symptoms and Cigarette Smoking Among Teens by E. Goodman and J. Capitman. It was published in 2000 by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Its objective was to assess the nature and direction of the relationship between cigarette smoking and depression among teenagers. Now, look at this writing in purple. It is cited by 372 other researchers, which makes it an incredibly valid, reliable study. That is great. If it's only got one citation, two citations, you probably want to look for a study that is a little more verifiable. Another issue is that studies often contradict one another. A valid study can be replicated, so it's important to determine if a study has been replicated by more than one researcher. So, for example, every other day we hear that coffee is either going to kill us or help us live to be 100. And the question is, has the study been reproduced to validate the information? And if it's not, then it is a very suspect claim. Atlantic magazine in 2010 looked at research studies and found about 40% of research studies on medical interventions could not be replicated or were found to be exaggerated. So that means almost half of the medical articles out there are questionable. And the problem is that people are not focusing in on reproducing other people's research. They want to create their own because that's how you become an academic rock star. So you have these multitude of issues that surround research studies. Another issue with research studies is that the interpretation of data can support conclusions, but they don't usually prove those conclusions. So remember, correlation does not mean causation. And that is, of course, one of the big confusing aspects for a lot of people when they hear these information studies being talked about on the news. Researchers and scientists also deal with personal interests, especially when they receive corporate grant money. So, for example, a researcher who works for a company that is financed by the Anheuser-Busch company is going to be attempting to demonstrate how awesome drinking beer is. It is in their best interest because this is how they keep their money and they keep their research money. The other aspect to this is that facts change over time. So, for example, cigarette companies claim that smoking was safe based on their own research studies. Their personal interest in selling more product eventually gave way to non-biased studies that showed the true link between smoking and cancer. And it wasn't until the late 1980s that this became a well-known fact that the cigarette companies hid their research. And this, more than anything else, the fact that the cigarette companies hid the research was why people really saw the cigarette companies as evil and not just providing a product that was not the healthiest. So when we evaluate research studies, we have to bear some level of doubt, but that doesn't mean you have to reject the study. Researchers continue to work towards minimizing that doubt each time a study is replicated or expanded. So every study that examined evolution has demonstrated that it exists, and therefore every country, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, except the United States, believes that evolution is a fact. And of course, in this country, it is a big debate on whether or not it actually exists. Certainty is often impossible, so students should look at the quality of the research, the attitude of other researchers towards the research, and the work that has been done to replicate those studies. So it's a multi-step process. It's not just looking at one metric. You have to look at a multitude of metrics. Another issue that we oftentimes see is the difference between making a generalization versus a gross generalization. And we talked about this when we talked about logical fallacies. And in that regard, we use the term sweeping generalizations. And that's generally the same thing as a gross generalization. So a generalization is taking something specific and applying it more broadly. So, for example, Italian food usually has garlic in it, and that's true. A gross generalization is taking something specific and applying it more broadly in an extreme way. So it's very similar to stereotyping. So, for example, we have a list of things here. I'll just read off a few of them. All dogs have fleas. Every Muslim is a terrorist. People from Kansas are boring. Russians are drunks, and cats are sneaky. So, are there some people from Kansas who are boring? Sure. Do some dogs have fleas? Yes. Are some cats sneaky? Sure. But the reality is that this extreme perspective is not a valid way to look at things. In a research study, when a researcher generalizes, they are seeking to represent a particular situation or experiment using what's called a sample. Sampling is the technique of selecting a representative part of a population for the purpose of determining parameters or characteristics of the whole population. So, for example, there are 330 million Americans living in the United States today. It is a mighty job every 10 years to do the census. But what we can do in between there is to look at representative samples. And whether we take 1 million people, 100,000, 10,000, as long as they represent the United States, we can make fairly good generalizations based on the value of the sample. And that's the important thing. The sample has to be characteristic of the population we are studying. So let's talk about how we evaluate sample size. The sample size must be large enough to justify generalizations. The larger the sample size, the better. The sample must contain breadth and diversity. What that means is that we have to include everyone in the sample that we are assessing. So, for example, if we are only looking at life expectancy for people who are white and middle class, we don't need to bring in African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, but we do need to have both men and women represented. So, for example, up until the beginning of the 1980s, most heart disease research was conducted exclusively on men. And at some point, someone realized that women may have different issues with heart disease, and they were right. And now you see an equal, well, not really equal, but at least in the ballpark of research being done on men and women. The population should be randomly selected. So, for example, in 2012, when Mitt Romney was trying to become president and defeat Obama, his pollsters had convinced him that he was going to win. And they based their information on phone calls to people during the day who had landlines as opposed to cell phones. People who are home during the day with landlines tend to be older, white, and less likely to be Democrats. So, of course, they had a maladaptive sample, so they were only looking at a very particular group of people. Whereas the Democratic pollsters were looking online, and they were using internet polls. And the vast majority of people under the age of 60 are on the internet on a fairly regular basis. So their information was almost 100% dead on. And, that's the kind of breadth and depth that we need when we're looking at our samples. If these three qualities are not assessed properly, the research would be flawed and generalizations would be wrong. And as we know, Mitt Romney lost the election, and his pollsters had to go back and look at what they did wrong. So now we have to look at how they did the actual evaluation. So when we test a hypothesis, researchers must design a methodology that will accurately test their theory. A common evaluation method is to ask oneself if the testing method seems valid. Also, look for criticisms of the methodology by other researchers. And here's the thing, folks. Academics are worse than any of the Real Housewives you see on TV. Academics can be jealous, they can be vindictive, they can be evil to one another. So if there is any cause to question the reality or methodology of a researcher, you're going to find it. One common problem is that the methods, especially collection methods, are not very good. So, for example, there is a study that tries to determine if a 3-year-old understands the concept of delayed gratification. So they're told that they'll get a special toy if they don't eat any grapes for 20 minutes. So they put the grapes in a bowl in front of the 3-year-old, and they have to not eat them for 20 minutes. But the question really is, how much do kids love grapes? Whereas if we put in front of them a bowl of jelly beans or lollipops, would the 3-year-old be able to delay gratification for that toy? So again, what we see here is, could the collection of information be better? Is the methodology flawed? So other problems with methodology can include collecting data from participants who are not complying with requirements of the study. So, for example, if you are conducting a study on cancer and you have people who are supposed to be following a particular diet, and you have some portion of that study group who are not following it and who are in fact lying about it, then that invalidates oftentimes some of the methodologies. Using faulty equipment, treating participants inappropriately, and recording data incorrectly. So, a lot of researchers use surveys and questionnaires, and these can also be biased in their own lovely way. So, first we have an issue with honesty. Some survey questions may be very personal and respondents may be embarrassed about their answers, especially when it comes to sex and drug use, so they may lie. So if you are doing a study on how many people smoke marijuana on a daily basis, a lot of people are going to be reluctant to admit that if they're middle class, career-oriented, or parents, because what if somebody finds out that someone is getting high every night after the kids go to bed? Another problem is ambiguous or poorly worded questions. These types of surveys can be confusing or interpreted in multiple ways. So, for example, look at this question. Is there too much sex on television? You should ask, what kind of sexual activity? Are we just talking about kissing, flirting, or are we going the simulated intercourse? You should also ask, is this basic network television, channels, ABC, CBS, NBC? Or are we talking about the network programs on TNT and TBS and FX and all the other nominal channels out there? Or are we looking at premium channels like Showtime? Or are we looking at Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu? Television can be interpreted in 100 different ways these days. What about people who only watch shows on their tablet or their phone? And then, of course, the word sex can mean any number of things. Some people are offended by watching people kiss. Other people are only offended when there's nudity. So all of these issues that come into play come from this idea that we're giving people ambiguous questions they have to interpret for themselves, which changes the way people look at the questionnaire based on their own filters and biases. So another problem with biases in surveys and questionnaires includes biased wording. And this is using words that evoke a strong reaction. So, for example, when people are asked if they approve of the law that protects them from losing insurance due to a pre-existing condition, there is an overwhelming support for this. However, when the question is rephrased to include the term Obamacare, only 47% approve of this law. So, when you use words that are loaded, people have very different reactions. Another issue is bias context. A survey that is too long can have a huge influence on the results. So if you're asked to do a survey and it says it'll take you 10 minutes and an hour later you're still working on it, oftentimes you'll just say, to heck with it, I'm not doing this anymore. Additionally, you should examine if the survey is conducted online, privately on paper, with a questionnaire, or is it anonymous or not. People are very reluctant to give out their name and other information. And as mentioned before, some people may be embarrassed by their answers about sensitive topics. So you should always look at the procedures before you accept the results. That's a very important point. Now, another evidentiary methodology is called identifying analogies. And analogies are comparisons that uses a well-known similarity between two things as the basis for a conclusion about a relatively unknown characteristic of one of these. So, for example, the right of free speech and the right to freedom of religion in the United States are very well known. Everybody knows this. Religious institutions have the right to say what they want about different groups. So, for example, the Mormons did not allow black people to be priests because they believed they were born with the mark of Cain, who killed his brother Abel after mom and dad got tossed out of the Garden of Eden. And the Mormon leadership continued this policy until the late 1970s, when they had a revelation that maybe they shouldn't be doing this anymore. So you'll see over there on the right, the front cover of the Salt Lake Tribune, when it was decided to allow black people to become priests in the Mormon religion. Most recently, the Mormons have come out against gay parents and are saying that the children of gay parents are basically not allowed to be baptized. And again, this is freedom of religion, freedom of speech in the religion. Now, a group that is pretty much universally loathed in this country is the Westboro Baptist Church, because one of the favorite things they like to do is go and picket military funerals and funerals for children and other shooting victims, because they believe that the United States allowing gay marriage has caused God to offer this retribution. And these people, despite how horrific it is for the families, have every right, because of our freedom of religion and our freedom of free speech, to picket these funerals. And equally, you have other groups that have the same freedom to stand in front of these groups and prevent the families from having to see this. So it is essentially one of those scenarios where you have to apply it equally to all groups, not just the ones who are sane. Other examples of analogies: relearning how to solve algebra problems is like riding a bike. Once you start doing it, it all comes back to you. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Romeo sees Juliet as a brilliant, life-giving force that allows him to survive. And just as the Earth revolves around the sun, an electron revolves around the nucleus. What a general is to an army, a CEO is to the company. And then lastly, just as a gun is the weapon of a soldier, a pen is the weapon of a writer. So these analogies oftentimes allow us to understand a very complicated issue in a very simplified way. Steve Jobs, formerly the head of Apple before he passed away, was the king of analogies. And one of his most famous quotes was, "Creativity is just connecting things. When you ask creative people how they did something, they feel a little guilty because they didn't really do it. They just saw something. It seemed obvious to them after a while. That's because they were able to connect experiences they've had and synthesize new things." So one of the things that Steve Jobs was famous for was creating the terminology that we all use with computers today. He named the computer a desktop because everyone is familiar with the top of their desk, and that's where the computer would be kept. He named the pages people generated documents because, again, all of us back in the olden days before we all had computers understood what a document was. And finally, he named these items that collectively were documents, they went into a file, like a file cabinet. He created these terms because he wanted people to embrace the unfamiliar by giving them something familiar to start with. So you start with the known and you take them to the unknown. And this building of the analogy will help people understand things in a much more intuitive sense. Now, we also have to evaluate analogies. So when we evaluate them, we have to focus on two issues: the ways the two things being compared are similar and different, and the relevance of those similarities and differences. So read this example. I do not allow my dog to run around at night unsupervised. So why should I allow my 16-year-old son to go out at night without me? So let's look at the similarities. Both the dog and the teenager are the parent's responsibility, and neither have the rights associated with an adult. The differences. The dog is an animal, and the son is a human. Dogs lack higher order thinking and cannot assess right from wrong. A human has the potential to assess situation. Doesn't mean they will, but they have the potential. Also, a human has some basic rights and deserves some level of autonomy or independence. So, consequently, this analogy would fail, although they're both very cute. Usually, the greater the proportion of relevant similarities compared to the relevant differences, the stronger the analogy. In other words, the more similarities, the better. So let's talk about expert opinion now and how to evaluate it. Remember, an opinion is justified by reason and evidence, not just because it feels right. You can scrutinize the expert's credentials and experiences and not find any inconsistencies or questions about their integrity. So last week when we talked about the gentleman who was working for the courts in Florida and other states saying gay parents were not people he would trust, and then you find out later that he is a closeted homosexual, this integrity issue would absolutely negate the expert opinion. Often, expert opinions will include a qualifying statement that limits their opinion to a specific idea or situation. So, for example, you might have someone who is vehemently against capital punishment, except when there's DNA proof. That's a qualifying statement. Experts do not overly generalize or make gross generalizations. It is an opinion based on a multitude of research studies within a certain field. So there's been a lot of research, and a lot of this opinion has been shared by other experts. And these experts not only have found and examined the opinion, they have not found fault. Finally, critical discussion exists that supports the expert's opinion on the subject. So, is there other research out there that proves that the expert is on a track where there is a preponderance of information that is agreed upon? Finally, let's talk about the internet, everyone's favorite tool. It is an awesome place, but it is also a place of chaos and pandemonium. It is important to keep this in mind as you seek out sources that may or may not be valid. Anyone can create a website or blog and fill it with all kinds of misinformation and crackpot ideas. Anyone. You can take the craziest loon in the world, give them a website, they can buy it for $10 from GoDaddy, build it for free, and you can say anything you want. The problem is, some people actually think you are an expert. Your first step should be to determine if the owner of the website or the author of the material is reliable. Are they a credible human being? Or are they a guy who lives in the basement of his parents' house and has not put on real clothes in a year? This is one of the reasons that instructors won't let you use Wikipedia. Anyone can edit any entry. And one of the most popular things to do is to complain a celebrity has died. Is to claim a celebrity has died. Sinbad, the gentleman on the right, his Wikipedia page is always being changed to show that he is dead, and he is very much alive. The issue here is that Wikipedia tries to police itself, but it's a very small organization that contains billions of pieces of information. So no matter how well a job they do policing itself, it is not 100% verifiable. So that finishes up this chapter. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or text message me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.